Vera and Cadence's first confrontation establishes the emotional thesis of the producer with quiet devastation, framing their marriage as a site where love, labor, queerness, and survival collide, under pressures that many queer women recognize instantly. Vera's rejection of Cadence's work is not only moral discomfort but a deeper fear about visibility, respectability, and what it costs to be seen loving another woman in a world that still polices women's desire. When Vera sneers the word porn, the contempt carries more than judgment. It carries panic that Cadence's gaze, once reserved for her, has become public, professional, and therefore uncontrollable. Cadence's defense is not pride but necessity. She speaks as a provider, a role queer women are often forced to overperform in order to justify their existence, their relationships, and their families. The fact that Cadence supports a teacher wife and a newborn child exposes a cruel irony. Her work is condemned even as it sustains the very domestic stability society claims to value. Vera's grief is layered. She is not only afraid of infidelity but mourning the loss of intimacy that once affirmed her as uniquely chosen. Cadence no longer reaches for her, and this absence becomes symbolic of how queerness itself can be starved when survival demands compartmentalization. Cadence insists there is no other woman, yet the reassurance rings hollow because the issue is not literal betrayal, but emotional displacement. For many lesbian viewers, this scene reflects the familiar ache of watching a partner retreat behind work, obligation, or social expectation, leaving desire unspoken and unmet. Vera's longing is quiet, almost apologetic, shaped by a culture that teaches women to minimize need and to fear being too much. Cadence's plea, "Please accept me," reverses expected power dynamics, revealing her own vulnerability and exhaustion. She is asking not only for forgiveness, but for permission to exist whole without splitting herself into acceptable and unacceptable parts. The presence of their child intensifies this conflict, symbolizing both hope and entrapment, as queer women are often told motherhood should resolve identity struggles rather than deepen them. This scene challenges the assumption that stability equals fulfillment, showing instead how repression can thrive inside socially legible domesticity. Society's discomfort with women loving women surfaces here not through spectacle, but through silence, through what is withheld rather than what is shown. The argument never explodes, it erodes. For queer audiences, this erosion feels painfully real, mirroring how relationships can fray under the weight of having to constantly explain, justify, and sanitize love. Vera represents the desire for emotional safety and exclusivity in a world that rarely offers it to queer women, while Cadence embodies the cost of visibility, ambition, and self-definition when those traits are punished rather than celebrated. Their exchange becomes a portrait of two women trapped between loving each other and surviving a culture that still demands proof, restraint, and sacrifice from queer families, asking them to be grateful for crumbs while denying them fullness. The second movement, where Cadence interacts with Annie and then Zoe, complicates the emotional terrain by exposing the fractures Cadence tries, and fails, to keep sealed. With Annie, Cadence's professional demeanor initially appears controlled, almost clinical, reinforcing the narrative she offers Vera about separation between work and intimacy. Yet beneath this surface lies a restlessness that queer viewers may recognize as the consequence of long-term suppression. Cadence's connection with Zoe, the new talent, becomes charged not through explicit action, but through contrast. Zoe represents possibility unburdened by history, expectation, or domestic obligation. She is new, unscarred by compromise, and open in a way that reminds Cadence of who she once was before survival hardened into routine. The emotional pull Cadence feels toward Zoe is not framed as conquest but as recognition, the kind that happens when one woman sees another and feels momentarily seen in return. This is where the film speaks directly to lesbian audiences who understand how desire can emerge not from dissatisfaction alone, but from the longing to feel authentic and alive. Cadence's inability to restrain herself emotionally is less about infidelity than about fragmentation. She has split herself so completely that intimacy leaks out where it can. Zoe, unaware of the full context, becomes a mirror rather than a villain, reflecting Cadence's buried hunger for connection without shame. For women watching, especially queer women, this dynamic resonates with the experience of finding affirmation outside sanctioned spaces, because those spaces feel safer, freer, or less policed. The film resists moralizing Zoe or reducing her to temptation, instead positioning her as a catalyst that exposes how unsustainable Cadence's internal divisions have become. Society's discomfort with women expressing love for each other lingers here in subtler ways. In the expectation that queer women must be either monogamous, symbols of respectability, or transgressive fantasies, with no room for complexity in between. Cadence exists in that forbidden middle, neither saint nor spectacle, and the tension unsettles because it refuses easy categorization. Annie's presence underscores this. showing how women are often asked to manage emotional fallout quietly, absorbing discomfort to keep systems running smoothly. Cadence's behavior mirrors real-world pressures on queer women to compartmentalize desire, to hide emotional truths, and to justify longing as accidental rather than essential. The interactions highlight how emotional intimacy, when denied legitimacy, seeks alternative routes, often creating harm despite the absence of malicious intent. For women broadly, the scene speaks to the cost of living in roles that reward productivity over presence, asking them to choose between being needed and being known. Zoe symbolizes visibility without apology, while Cadence symbolizes visibility negotiated through compromise. Their connection challenges viewers to consider why women's desire still provokes anxiety, why it must be explained or excused, and why queer women are so often denied narratives that allow growth without punishment. Ultimately, this scene is not about betrayal, but about becoming visible to oneself, about the risk inherent in acknowledging desire when doing so threatens carefully constructed lives. It invites LGBTQ+ audiences to see their own struggles reflected with honesty, honoring the messy human truth of longing as part of survival rather than a failure of it. Scene 3 of The Producer unfolds with a deceptively quiet premise that carries immense emotional weight, capturing a moment many queer women recognize not as scandal but as suspension, the fragile space between intention and action where desire is negotiated, internally, long before it is ever expressed aloud. Cadence's decision to say yes to seeing Annie the following day is framed not as a dramatic turning point, but as an act of courage born from emotional starvation, a choice that feels simultaneously small and enormous. For lesbian and LGBTQ+ audiences, this resonates deeply because queerness so often teaches people that wanting connection is already a transgression, that even agreeing to a conversation can feel like crossing an invisible line. Cadence knows, before the doorbell ever rings, that Vera would interpret Annie's visit as betrayal, not because of what happens, but because of what it represents. Attention redirected, curiosity awakened, the possibility of being seen differently. The scene carefully centers Cadence's interiority, showing how she tries to push Vera out of her mind not out of cruelty but out of survival, because holding everyone at once inside her becomes unbearable. The ritual of changing clothes 5 times is profoundly symbolic, speaking to the way women, and especially queer women, are conditioned to self-monitor, endlessly, to ask what version of themselves is safest, most appropriate, least disruptive. This is not vanity, it is strategy. Each outfit represents a different possible self, one aligned with professionalism, one with neutrality, one with desire, one with denial, until Cadence finally chooses what feels right, even if she cannot articulate why. For many viewers, this moment mirrors the familiar anxiety of preparing to be perceived by another woman in a way that feels charged, yet unnamed, where clothing becomes armor and invitation simultaneously. When Annie arrives in a red party dress, the contrast is immediate and meaningful. Red, often coded by society as bold or provocative, here functions instead as emotional clarity. Annie arrives already comfortable with her presence, unafraid of being seen, embodying a confidence that feels aspirational and dangerous to Cadence, who has spent so long compartmentalizing herself. The flirtatious look in Annie's eye is not framed as seduction but as openness, a signal that she is aware of the emotional undercurrent and unashamed of it. Her line, "I was hoping to pick your brain," operates on multiple levels, offering plausible deniability while acknowledging curiosity, a duality queer women know well because it allows connection to exist in a world that demands justification. Cadence's sudden awareness that Vera is home sharpens the tension, reminding viewers that queer desire often unfolds under surveillance, internal or external, where the presence of another woman's expectations can shape every thought. This awareness does not erase Cadence's feelings, but fractures them, forcing her to hold loyalty, guilt, curiosity, and longing all at once. For women watching, this scene speaks to the exhausting emotional labor of constantly contextualizing one's feelings, of asking whether desire is allowed, appropriate, or worth the consequences. The film resists framing this as moral failure, instead presenting it as a symptom of repression and unmet emotional needs. Society's discomfort with women expressing love for each other lingers heavily here, not through explicit condemnation but through the necessity of secrecy, the way Cadence must narrate her own actions as innocent to make them palatable even to herself. This insistence on innocence reveals how deeply women are taught to distrust their own desires, especially when those desires do not center men or heterosexual validation. Annie, in contrast, symbolizes a different relationship to desire, one less burdened by apology. Yet, she is not portrayed as reckless or manipulative. She is simply present, curious, and emotionally available. This balance allows queer viewers to see both women as complex rather than archetypal, resisting the cultural urge to cast one as wrong and the other as right. The interaction mirrors real-world pressures on queer women to hide, to minimize, or to intellectualize their feelings. turning emotional intimacy into something that must be justified as conversation, mentorship, or coincidence. Cadence's effort to keep Vera out of her mind underscores how guilt can coexist with genuine need, and how loving one woman does not automatically erase the capacity to connect with another. For lesbian audiences, this challenges simplistic narratives of fidelity by acknowledging emotional truth without glamorizing harm. The scene also resonates with women broadly, regardless of orientation, because it captures the universal fear of being fully seen, of allowing oneself to want something that might disrupt carefully maintained lives. Cadence's internal struggle reflects the cost of prioritizing stability over authenticity, a trade many women are encouraged to make quietly. The presence of Vera in the home, even unseen, becomes a symbol of expectation and history, while Annie represents possibility and present-moment awareness. Neither is villainized. Instead, the tension arises from Cadence's inability to reconcile these parts of her life within a society that offers no compassionate framework for doing so. This discomfort persists today because women's emotional worlds are still policed, their desires scrutinized for meaning and consequence in ways men's rarely are. When women love women, that scrutiny intensifies, as if their connections threaten existing hierarchies simply by existing outside them. Scene 3 refuses spectacle, focusing instead on the quiet choreography of glances, thoughts, and choices that define so much of queer experience. It invites viewers to sit with ambiguity rather than resolve it, honoring the truth that becoming visible often begins internally, long before any outward declaration. For LGBTQ+ audiences seeking authenticity, this moment validates the complexity of longing, showing that desire is not inherently destructive but becomes fraught when denied space to be acknowledged honestly. The scene suggests that visibility is not just about being seen by others, but about allowing oneself to recognize what one feels without immediately judging it. In doing so, it offers a deeply empathetic portrayal of women navigating love, loyalty, and self-discovery in a world that still asks them to explain why their hearts beat the way they do. Scenes 4 and 5 of The Producer mark a culmination rather than a resolution, presenting a portrait of queer adulthood, where success, visibility, and commitment do not simplify desire, but instead intensify its contradictions. And in doing so, the film speaks with rare honesty to women who have learned that being seen does not automatically mean being understood. A year has passed, and Cadence's business is thriving, a detail that matters deeply because it reframes her arc not as a cautionary tale but as one of professional legitimacy, ambition fulfilled, and public recognition. Achievements queer women are often told should quiet internal conflict but rarely do. Annie, now not only Cadence's partner but her fiancé, stands beside her as both collaborator and emotional witness, embodying a love that has moved from secrecy into structure. For LGBTQ+ audiences, this shift carries weight because it reflects the dream many queer women are promised, that once love is named, chosen, and formalized, the chaos will settle. Yet the introduction of Emma unsettles this fantasy immediately, not because Emma is inherently disruptive, but because she represents youth, novelty, and possibility in a world that still privileges those qualities over depth and history. Cadence has been waiting 6 months to shoot Emma, and the anticipation itself reveals something crucial about her interior life, suggesting that longing has not disappeared but merely found new objects. Thoughts of Emma's beauty fill Cadence's mind, and the film carefully avoids framing this as lust, instead positioning it as distraction, fascination, and emotional charge, the kind that arises when one woman's presence reawakens parts of another that have been dormant. The difficulty Cadence has concentrating when Annie is in front of her is quietly devastating because it reverses earlier dynamics and shows how desire's direction can wound even when no explicit betrayal occurs. Annie senses this shift intuitively, as many women do, and her jealousy is not portrayed as possessive hysteria, but as a deeply human response to feeling deprioritized, a reminder that emotional security is fragile even in committed relationships. For lesbian viewers, this resonates painfully, reflecting the fear that queer relationships must constantly prove themselves resilient in a culture that still doubts their durability. The tension between Annie and Cadence follows them into the shoot, blurring the boundary between professional collaboration and private hurt, illustrating how queer couples often lack the luxury of separation between work and intimacy, especially in industries where queerness is both commodity and liability. Annie's jealousy burns not because Cadence is successful, but because Cadence's attention has shifted, and attention for women who love women often carries more weight than overt action. Emma, flattered by Cadence's focus, encourages it, not as manipulation but as affirmation, embodying a social script that rewards women for being desired, while rarely asking them to consider the emotional ecosystems they enter. Emma's role is particularly complex, because she is neither villain nor ingenue. She is a woman navigating a system that prizes her youth and beauty, responding to validation as many would. This nuance allows queer audiences to recognize the structural forces at play rather than reducing the conflict to personal failure. Cadence stands at the center of this triangle as both creator and participant, her power entangled with her vulnerability, illustrating how queer women in positions of authority often struggle to reconcile professional admiration with personal boundaries because they have been denied healthy models for doing so. The question of whether Annie will put up with Cadence's behavior is telling, reflecting societal expectations that women, particularly queer women, should tolerate emotional erosion quietly to preserve stability. Annie's presence challenges this expectation by making her discomfort visible, even if she has not yet found language or leverage to address it. For women watching, Annie's jealousy may feel uncomfortably familiar, echoing moments when intuition signals danger before evidence appears, and when expressing that intuition risks being labeled insecure or controlling. The film's refusal to sensationalize this tension allows space for empathy, inviting viewers to sit with the discomfort rather than rushing to judgment. Cadence's attraction to Emma also raises questions about age, power, and novelty that resonate beyond queerness, speaking to a broader cultural obsession with the new and the fear of becoming ordinary or replaceable. For queer women, this fear is often amplified by histories of invisibility, making validation feel precious and precarious. Cadence's internal pull toward Emma mirrors the temptation to feel alive through external recognition rather than through the slower, sometimes harder work of sustaining intimacy. Annie, by contrast, symbolizes continuity, shared history, and the labor of building something lasting, roles often undervalued in narratives that celebrate passion over partnership. Society's discomfort with women expressing love for each other surfaces here in the expectation that their relationships must either be pure and monogamous or chaotic and doomed, leaving little room for honest depictions of struggle that do not end in punishment. This discomfort persists because women's desire, when detached from male validation, threatens entrenched hierarchies by asserting autonomy over emotional and creative life. Scenes 4 and 5 challenge this by presenting queer women not as ideals or warnings but as people navigating competing needs for affirmation, safety, and growth. The shoot itself becomes a symbolic stage where private emotions are performed under professional guise, reflecting how queer women often mask personal turmoil to maintain credibility and success. Emma's encouragement of Cadence's attention highlights how systems reward emotional leakage, turning it into currency rather than addressing its cost. Annie's jealousy, meanwhile, exposes the vulnerability that accompanies loving someone whose identity and work are publicly consumed, a reality many queer couples face as visibility increases. For LGBTQ+ audiences seeking authenticity, these scenes offer recognition rather than resolution, acknowledging that love does not eliminate longing and that commitment does not guarantee clarity. They suggest that becoming visible, whether through success or partnership, does not absolve one from the work of self-examination. Instead, visibility can sharpen awareness of what remains unresolved. By centering women's interior lives and refusing to moralize their desires, the producer invites viewers to consider how queer women are pressured to justify their feelings constantly, to frame them as phases, flaws, or professional hazards rather than truths. Scenes 4 and 5 thus function as a mirror, reflecting the reality that authenticity is not a destination reached once, but a practice maintained amid shifting power, desire, and fear. For women watching, queer or otherwise, the story affirms that longing is not a failure of love, but a signal calling for honesty, and that emotional safety cannot be sustained through silence. In honoring this complexity without spectacle, the film offers a rare, compassionate space where women's love for each other is treated not as fantasy or taboo, but as a deeply human endeavor, marked by growth, contradiction, and the ongoing challenge of staying visible to oneself as well as to others.